This is the exact moment when 7-year-old Arthur Labinjo Hughes would give up on life. And within 5 hours, an emergency 999 call would be made that would reveal to the world the most heartbreaking story on the internet. The story of Arthur Labinjo Hughes.
Ambulance service, is the patient breathing?
Barely.
Okay, is he breathing right now though, even if he's...
Is he breathing, Tom? He keeps taking big dark breaths. Basically, my 6-year-old stepson is fallen, he's banged his head.
Okay.
And while he was on the floor, he's banged his head another 5 times.
Okay.
He's lost colour, he's got a big lump on his head.
No way.
He'd fallen and hit his head, but he was found in a condition that a fall could not justify.
If Arthur could ask for one final thing, it would be that he was remembered for his superpowers. And Arthur's superpower was his smile.
He was surrounded by many guardian angels, but during COVID-19, Arthur had to be confined with pure evil and lived through hell every day of his life. The Midlands, England Police Department would soon discover the most horrific secret clips and videos that they'd wish they could unsee.
Emergency which service?
The call came in on June 17, 2020. 6-year-old Arthur Labinjo Hughes had taken a fall down the stairs, and the voice on the line was frantic. Paramedics arrived to find him gasping for air, and despite every effort to save him, Arthur's life slipped away. It seemed like a tragic accident, until the doctors noticed something that would haunt them for years. There were horrific injuries that didn't match the story from the call. Arthur had died of catastrophic brain injuries. The doctors said the damage was equivalent to a car crash. Even the paramedics on the scene noted severe head trauma and multiple bruises across his body. The truth was hidden in plain sight, buried in the frantic words and background noises of the 999 call that would change everything. When the recording was played again, this time with sharper ears and deeper suspicion, the real story behind Arthur's tragic end would leave everyone shocked. What had once seemed like desperation now echoed with something far darker.
Is breathing noisy or abnormal?
Is it noisy or abnormal? It's barely there, he's barely breathing, he's in and out, he's taking hard.
Okay.
He's basically been treating us all up. He's threw himself on the floor, he's headbutting the floor. I'm trying to pick him up in the process, he's headbutting me in the process.
Okay.
I've got him up, he was breathing like a little bit better at first.
Yeah.
Washed him down, put some water down him, tried to obviously get him like, a bit more colour in him, but then obviously I've seen the lump on his head that he's done to himself.
Right.
The female voice you just heard was 32-year-old Emma Tustin, the caregiver and stepmother of 6-year-old Arthur Labinjo Hughes. His father, 29-year-old Thomas Hughes, wasn't present when the alleged accident occurred, leaving Emma as the sole witness of Arthur's last moments. She was also the one who accompanied Arthur to the hospital, recounting how he suffered the injuries. But something didn't sit right with the doctors. Their suspicions led them to involve the police, and soon detectives were asking Emma for her first official statement.
Just briefly, what happened?
Basically, he'd gone out to get me a cake and stuff for the kids. Arthur was told to sit on the thinking step. Arthur's put himself all over the floor. He's banged himself off the radiator. He's hit me, he's kicked me in the process, and we're trying to get him back on the thinking step.
The thinking step was the punishment area designed for Arthur by his father Thomas and stepmother Emma. It was a place for him to stand and reflect on his actions. According to Emma, Arthur frequently found himself there due to his behavior. However, on the evening of June 17, 2020, the day of his death, Arthur was especially rude and physically violent.
He's then gone on all fours on the floor, and I've told him to get up. And I shut the door over, and all I heard was a crack off the floor. Like I say, he's like the last 6 months, he's battered both my kids. He's smashed this house. And even so, I've done my best for that kid. I tried to get him off the floor, but he'd banged his head 3 or 4 times. Obviously, the ambulance picked him up. He'd knocked himself unconscious. I picked him up, put him on the sofa, poured water in his mouth.
So you come in, he's banged his head 3 or 4
I was
times
in the living room.
here.
I was in the kitchen, then I'd sat down in the living room, and that's when he threw himself on the floor.
And you heard him banging his
I heard
head.
him bang his head.
So what did you do?
I came out to him and told him to get up. He told me no. So I tried to bear hug him. I put my arms underneath him and pick him up, and he dropped, and he banged his head another 3 times off the floor. And as I picked him up, he hit me and he kicked me as I was trying to get him up.
Emma had an emotional moment talking about the unruly child who abused her. Like many other stepmothers, her affection was not reciprocated. However, Emma's story largely stayed the same as the details in the 999 call, and the narrative failed to align. Further investigation was essential, but it would still lead to a truth so disturbing it would stick with the investigators for the rest of their careers. Arthur was put on life support, but by 1 a.m. the following day, it was determined that there was nothing more that could be done, and the life support was switched off. As the investigation pressed on, a forensic examination revealed Arthur had over 130 separate injuries in various stages of healing from head to toe. Every single part of his tiny body was bruised and hurt. His thymus gland and one of his kidneys were severely shrunken, a result of prolonged physical stress. However, the cause of death was bleeding on the brain and a complete detachment of the retina in his right eye. Little did the experts know that this was just the very tip of the iceberg. When he was first taken to the hospital, he had severely elevated levels of sodium in his body. 7 hours later, these levels remained unchanged, indicating that his body couldn't properly absorb the excess salt he'd ingested. It was estimated that to achieve such sodium levels, Arthur would have needed to consume 6 tablespoons of salt in one day, or more likely, be poisoned with high levels of salt over several days. The autopsy report and the inflicted injuries clearly amounted to torture, but it wasn't even that made this the most notorious case in Middleton. It was the horrific discoveries that were yet to emerge during the investigation, capturing public attention like a raging wildfire. Authorities had discovered the unimaginable horror that was forced upon the innocent child, and they were closing in on the sadistic monster who had committed the unthinkable. There was little doubt something was not right behind teary-eyed Emma and fidgety Thomas's story. Speculations were swirling across the country, but it soon became evident that these were not merely assumptions. The challenge was to find what horrors cooked behind the scenes. The Middleton police quickly obtained a search warrant for Emma's 2-bedroom house where she lived with her boyfriend, Thomas Hughes, and their children from previous marriages. At first glance, nothing seemed particularly noteworthy, except for a CCTV camera installed in the living room. Emma and Thomas told investigators it was for monitoring Arthur and ensuring he didn't harm himself. When the investigators took the recordings for further investigation, they had no clue it contained horrifying secrets that they would wish they could unsee. The CCTV footage contained heartbreaking details of little Arthur's final hours, scenes that would terrify everyone who laid eyes on them. This disturbing recording was a couple of hours before Arthur had the alleged accident. Arthur begged for someone named Blake to come and rescue him. So who were these people that Arthur was counting on near his end? Blake was Arthur's uncle, brother of Thomas Hughes. Arthur could be seen frail, weak, and barely standing when he called for his family beyond Emma and Thomas. As the hours of these recordings were being investigated, detectives would reach out to Arthur's grandparents and Uncle Blake. The family was not only forthcoming, but had much to share. Arthur was born on January 4th, 2014. Just a year earlier, he was one of the happiest children one could meet. He adored superheroes and was a big fan of Birmingham City Football Club.
Arthur, are you going to play for England? No, why not?
After when I've played for Liverpool, I can play for Tottenham.
Firstly, Arthur was the happiest child. He was very, very much loved by everyone. He was my daughter's baby bear, and he was my sunny delight. As I say, he's very happy-go-lucky.
People who knew him described him as bright and full of energy. However, as the grandparents would delve into the details, it would become quite clear Arthur was a happy but not a very lucky child. He was born to a couple, Thomas and Olivia Labinjo Hughes, that had met during drug dates together. When the parents separated, Arthur remained with Olivia, but she would enter into a new relationship that was toxic through and through. It was a man named Gary Cunningham, whom she had met during an alcohol awareness course. Both Olivia and Gary were violent towards each other. This toxic relationship ultimately reached a tragic climax in February 2019 when Olivia, in a drunken rage, killed Gary by stabbing him 12 times. However, the most shocking part about this incident was that little Arthur was actually witnessing the murder. In 2020, Olivia was sentenced for 11 years. As the mother served her sentence, little Arthur moved in with his father Thomas and his grandparents. The love he'd known primarily came from his grandparents and his Uncle Blake. this was the safest time Arthur had ever experienced. But the wave of happy time would soon die down, and the trail of misfortune began with a simple date. His father, Thomas, would go on a date with a woman named Emma Tustin that he'd met online. As the investigation would open, detectives would get to know Emma had a history of erratic and attention-seeking behavior. Back in 2013, she'd jumped from the top of a multi-story car park after her boyfriend threatened to leave her. On another occasion, she threw herself out of a bedroom window to prevent her partner from going to the pub with his best friend. An ex-boyfriend of hers was interviewed by the Daily Mail, and he said, "She's a black widow and she sucks the life out of every man she gets together with. She has no maternal instinct whatsoever. She wanted children for the attention they brought her as newborns and for the child benefits, but once the attention died away and she was left at home with a baby, she didn't want to know." She was also blamed to be a neglectful mother, and social services often made visits to her house. What happened when this woman stepped into Thomas and ultimately Arthur's lives would be the final use of her evil. Though Thomas was never the best father, he wasn't a complete nightmare either. However, that would soon change as he and Emma grew closer, leaving Arthur to lose his father in a way he never anticipated. Arthur joined his father and Emma on several outings, but each time he returned, the grandparents found him increasingly reluctant to go back with them.
His dad came to pick him up, and Arthur said to his dad, "Is she in the car?" And his dad said yes, and Arthur started to cry, which isn't like Arthur.
When we're saying she, you mean?
I'm assuming it was Emma.
The warmth of family was fading, replaced by an unsettling tension he couldn't quite understand. According to his grandparents, they first saw something was not right in their own home. Arthur was terrified of Emma and often tried to hide whenever she visited. Thomas's parents and brother were not fond of her either, sensing an air of deceit and disregard. However, they couldn't have anticipated the extent of what was unfolding. During one of Emma's visits, as Arthur's grandmother tried to buy him a Subway sandwich, Emma abruptly told her not to feed him, claiming it was an unnecessary indulgence to him. This brief encounter served as a warning sign, revealing just how comfortable and eager Emma was to make decisions about Arthur's life. But it wasn't just her. Thomas's behavior was also changing. He'd begun to lose his temper easily. After a night at Emma's, Thomas returned with Arthur, and Blake noticed the little boy staring blankly at the wall. It was an unusual sight for a child. When Blake attempted to cheer him up with the snack, Thomas intervened, insisting that Arthur was being punished and shouldn't be fed. This was just the beginning of a nightmare that would only worsen. As the pandemic surged, the Prime Minister declared a complete lockdown.
From this evening, I must give the British people a very simple instruction. You must stay at home. Because the critical thing we must do to stop the disease spreading between households.
As people confined themselves to their homes to avoid danger, Arthur had the danger inside his own home. He fell under the wing of his father Thomas in Emma's house, separated from his beloved grandparents, and was rarely able to see them. Events were slowly aligning for a gradual decline for Arthur. During one occasion in lockdown, Arthur's grandmother noticed a blue bruise on his shoulder.
Straight away, I said, these are non-accidental injuries. I said, they're caused by an adult hand. I said, his right shoulder, I can see three fingers. I said, his left shoulder, I said, that has been caused by hitting with something or being pushed against something. But the most disturbing thing to me, and I said this to Chris and Joe, I said, there's new bruises on top of old, which tells me this has been going on. And, you know, there's yellow bruises, there was purple bruises, all over. His back.
Take your time.
And I just seen them, I just imagined the pain Arthur would have been in.
Despite being Thomas's mother, she acted quickly and filed a complaint with social services. The following day, when Arthur returned to Emma and Thomas's house, a representative from social services called Emma and came to visit. However, no action was taken. They claimed there's no bruise, insisting that Arthur and Emma's two other children appeared happy and well. However, the grandmother found the call before making the visit reason enough for Emma to be alert and take necessary steps to cover up. So Blake attempted to contact the Middleton police. But unfortunately, the officers never reached Arthur because they thought the case was taken by the social services. It wasn't just once. The family tried to ask for help for Arthur again and again. However, there'd be no result. Something horrible was happening to Arthur, and nobody could do anything.
They're wicked, evil.
In the meantime, the investigation into Arthur's death was flaring up. Arthur's grandparents and family pointed fingers at Emma and Thomas, but they weren't sure what could have led to Arthur's demise. A deeper investigation was launched against the couple, and the ugliest truths started to surface. Investigators seized their phones and began reviewing the contents. What they discovered in the audio recordings and text messages exchanged between Emma and Thomas was shocking. With each new line that appeared on the screen, the weight of what had been hidden behind closed doors became unbearably clear. Emma and Thomas were complicit in this nightmare, and their messages revealed the extent of their twisted partnership. The messages explained Arthur's living situation filled with hunger, isolation, and physical abuse. In most of these texts, Emma complained about the boy, venting frustrations, but also documenting her escalating cruelty. She was depriving Arthur of food and drink, forcing him to stand for hours in the hallway as a form of punishment. The little boy's cries for food and comfort were met with mockery. His desperation was called misbehavior in these messages. The messages back and forth served as a twisted form of reinforcement for both Emma and Thomas. She'd often record Arthur's distressed pleas, sending audio clips to Thomas when he wasn't at home, as if seeking approval for her harsh treatment. In response, Thomas would express his own frustration with Arthur and encourage her to be even more severe, telling her to just end him or suggesting violent measures to silence his cries. At times, the couple was just a few feet away from Arthur as they texted, their phones buzzing with cruel exchanges while the boy was left to cry himself hoarse in the hallway or suffer alone in his room. Emma expressed annoyance over Arthur's need for affection, calling it as him acting out or labeling it as spoiling him. Emma and Thomas discussed that Arthur should not be given certain foods or that he should be punished for minor infractions. The abuse wasn't limited to neglect. These messages were laden with verbal abuse and name-calling. The hatred for him in these messages was prominent from both sides. The messages provided clear evidence that the household atmosphere was one of intimidation and physical torment. Arthur had endured repeated assaults. In one of the messages, it came out that Emma and Thomas had a disagreement, leading Emma to express that she could accept Thomas, but not Arthur. Thomas responded sharply, insisting that she'd have to take both him and Arthur, or none at all. This exchange revealed the troubling dynamics of their relationship, as Emma's rejection of Arthur only increased Thomas's frustration. This tension indicated that Thomas's anger could easily escalate, leading to further mistreatment of Arthur. There were many questions, but one thing was clear. Arthur was living a miserable life, often going without food. One piece of CCTV footage that previously seemed insignificant took on a new meaning for the investigators. The footage revealed Thomas and Emma relaxing and enjoying ice cream on one of the hottest days of the year. Meanwhile, Arthur was forced to stand on the stairs, sweltering and starving, denied water while wearing a thick onesie that only added to his discomfort. Thomas sat cross-legged while Emma hunched over, indulging in McDonald's right in front of a starving Arthur who remained helpless in the hallway. The question arose, were all of Emma's children suffering in the same way? Arthur's grandparents informed the investigators that Emma's children were often left unfed for long hours, abandoned while Emma stayed in her room. However, what Arthur endured was uniquely horrific. In none of the footage did Emma's children appear to suffer the same level of abuse that Arthur did. Later, Emma's children would tell investigators that they too faced punishment if they tried to help Arthur. The disturbing details of this case seemed never-ending, as another heart-wrenching clip awaited their review. In these clips, Arthur could be seen standing and shuffling his feet. At first glance, it seemed harmless, until they realized he'd stood straight for up to 14 hours. As the harrowing details got closer, police would tighten their grip on Thomas and Emma, questioning them about Arthur and the heartbreaking details in the tapes. Piece by piece, Thomas and Emma's story of accident began to change. But it was Thomas who would come loose first and tell them the truth that was even more nightmarish than they already knew. Thomas told them that he might have gone too far in punishing Arthur. He described to the investigators that Arthur had some behavior issues because of which Emma and the family suffered. Although it was hard to understand what crime a 6-year-old could do to him to deserve a punishment, Thomas was about to tell. He'd learned about torture methods used during interrogation, methods that gave the maximum of pain without leaving scarring or bruises. So what really happened on June 17, 2020? Arthur was suffering for long, but did his body just give up? No, it was the simple and heartless truth of the case. There was in fact an even more heinous reality to the case. Thomas had gone to the supermarket with Emma's children while Arthur was left behind as usual. Starved and frail Arthur couldn't have done anything that Emma couldn't handle on her own, but she pinged to Thomas that Arthur was creating a problem when he told her to discipline him. Within a few hours, Emma decided to take things in her own hands and led Arthur to death. When Thomas returned, Arthur was already unconscious after Emma had already smashed his head against the wall several times. When Arthur didn't get up after a few failed attempts, Emma decided to call 999 with a story of how Arthur beat himself and then took a fall. Thomas shamelessly would tell the investigators it was his own fault and Emma should be let free. He told them it was him not being able to control Arthur and then being carried away and getting him killed. Emma was not to be blamed. The disturbing case shook the country from Middleton to the Parliament.
The public deserve to know why, in this rare case, things went horrifyingly wrong and what more could be done to prevent such as this happening again in the future.
With Arthur's death and the injuries clearly not self-inflicted, the authorities finally saw through Emma and Thomas's lies. Both were arrested and charged with Arthur's death. On December 3, 2021, at Emma's trial, the judge described the fatal attack as follows. The final act of killing was done by you, Tustin. You shook him so that his head was hyperextended and flexed on his neck, while simultaneously hitting it against the wall or the floor multiple times. The level of violence you used produced forces on his body equivalent to those experienced in a high-speed road traffic collision. The injuries sustained were extensive and devastating. Emma was convicted of murder and received a life sentence with a minimum term of 29 years. Thomas Hughes, who wasn't present during the fatal assault, was found guilty of manslaughter and sentenced to 21 years in prison. In December 2020, it was revealed that their sentences would be reviewed to assess if they were too lenient, possibly leading to longer terms for both. Emma had 4 children from previous relationships, though by the time she met Thomas, only the 2 youngest were still living with her. By then, Emma had already been reported to social services several times due to concerns about her children's welfare. However, she'd become skilled at manipulating these situations. Whenever social services visited, she'd resort to emotional tactics, crying and portraying herself as the victim. Each time, the authorities would leave without taking any further action. Social services had been part of the narrative all along, but their absence in action was a plot twist no one saw coming.
That social services couldn't intervene, and therefore it was down to the grandmother to seek further help?
Does just going to social services not trigger a multi-agency intervention? You have to go to a doctor. I don't understand.
It would trigger an intervention. You can put it into the multi-agency sharing hub. It will be looked at. It triggered the actual point of a social worker going out, but it's the matter of delay and the severity of when that was seen. And I wouldn't disparage anyone doing a referral, but what I'm saying is if you have a child that you're concerned is actually being harmed, medical professionals can support you as well to speed up the process and to actually see that moment in time of those injuries.
How is it the social services were involved so early in this case, yet Arthur's prolonged suffering was overlooked? What role do you think the social service played in sealing Arthur's fate? What do you think should have been done to rescue young Arthur from his merciless fate?